Good day. Welcome to the third Food Art Film Festival here at the Jan van Eyck Academy. This time in an online environment. It's a very special, weird occasion. Actually, having to do a festival within a lockdown situation because yesterday we heard that we have to go into lockdown. The whole country is going into lockdown, and it was great that we were prepared because we had an online program, 2 days festival, ready for you to go. This time, this program is curated by nonetheless Marente van der Valk, our food lab coordinator at the Jan van Eyck Academy, and Celine Pelcé. And it's featuring a great amount of artists and researchers in food thinking. We have Dr. Johnny Drain, who is famous expert on fermentation processes. We have Mark Frank, a local expert on wild foraging and agroforestry. And together with the participants, the food lab participants here at the Jan van Eyck Academy, Azli Atipoglu and Soft Protest Digest, who is a collective from Denmark and France residing here, consisting of Nikki Sigurdsson, Jeremy Rentjen Lando, and Robin Bantini. I welcome you. I wish you a wonderful 2-day festival, which is trying to investigate and going through the ideas of Utopia from Dystopia, thinking of food in hostile environments. It's also very special because it's an online occasion, which means that people have been able to order online ingredients to make food at home, and at the same time watch films that we provided to them through our website. So please go to the website and have a look at the program. And I will give the word now to Celine Pelcé, who will then say a little bit more about the details of the program. Welcome.
Well, again, welcome everyone to this Food Art Film Festival 2020. First, I'd like to thank all the Jan van Eyck Academy team for helping us having this little adventure in this kind of new format that we are now thinking of and experiencing. I'd like to also introduce you the person I co-organized the festival with, which is Marente van der Valk. She runs the food lab here in the Van Eyck. She's unfortunately not here anymore due to the whole COVID situation here, but I know she's watching us at the moment. Hi, Marente. So yeah, to have a word on the festival this year, we choose a theme to gather every artist of the program together around this subject of utopia, dystopia, eating our way out of hostility. We thought it would be interesting to focus a little bit on this theme due to COVID, but not really, I would say more generally due to the climate change we are facing, or the system we are now in, and how deeply survival is part of human food culture, and where it originates from, between like reflex and imagination, and we thought somehow it's where poetry and beauty emerge from knowledge and from radical creativity. And if we go focus on the climate warming phenomenon and these macro consequences, somehow we have to adapt our ways of life and our relation to the resources and the sources, the way we build our house, the way we dress, the way we eat, and more generally our relation to time and space. And it feels that we have to renew this relation, to renew our place in the environment, our relation to the soil, plants, animals, minerals, and really some cultures have always dealt with complex environment in the past and in now as well, and others are just starting facing it. And so for the programmation of this festival, we focused on different little subjects that can bring pieces of answers and propositions to raise up new imaginations for the future of food. So we have this online festival as you are attending right now, and we doubled everything, like every point of the program, with something that we can send at your home. So some things are already sold out if it's now that you are learning about it, but we thought it was still important that people could get in touch physically with something and get a physical part in the program. So there is some sourdough, some scobies, some readings, plants, seeds, pastries. So in many different ways, you can get in touch with this festival and the subjects it's raising up. So this is the first point of the program, a conversation I had with Dr. Johnny Drain. Dr. Johnny Drain is a crazy expert of fermentation. He's based in London, and he started going in fermentation through chemistry, but now he's really more into the food aspect of fermentation and the taste of it, the techniques that comes from all over the world to ferment all kinds of material. We talked about it for maybe a half an hour or something, and this is what you're going to see right now. And after this first point, we have different appointments if you want to join at 5 today with Ashley. At 7, and tomorrow again at noon and 5. So there are many points in the program. You can follow that online on the Jan van Eyck website. I should stop talking right now, and maybe we can launch the conversation with Johnny Drain. Thank you very much for following us.
Hi, Johnny. Welcome here, and thank you for coming. Before we start talking all about fermentation, I propose that you maybe give us a little introduction of yourself, your background, and how you got to fermentation and fermenting all kind of stuff.
Sure. So my name is Dr. Johnny Drain. I'm from the UK, and my route towards fermentation was essentially via science. So I studied chemistry and then did a PhD in something called materials science, which is a cross between chemistry and physics, looking at what are materials made of and how do you tune their properties to achieve some sort of functionality. And I'd always cooked a lot, and essentially, whether a chef or a bartender thinks they're doing that, they're actually, they're playing with the properties of materials and altering them in certain ways to produce certain results. So for me, it was a very natural lead into moving across to the world of food. And I started working with restaurants, doing research, and I guess found this niche where I could apply some of the, not necessarily the specific knowledge of my science background, but certainly that kind of framework and ways of thinking about problems and solving problems to food. And fermentation, I quickly realized was very ripe for that sort of thinking.
Yes, yeah. And the reason we invited you to participate to the festival is actually that we saw in our theme, which is like how to face hostility as a human being, right? It's a very, very wide question that probably takes its origin for like ever. But there are a certain obvious imbalance now in our world that is climate speaking, but also, of course, the whole system we're living in that we built. And we saw, and I think you also see it, that fermentation can be a way to go through this imbalanced world, or maybe to fight against it or to, I don't know, create new tools to live with it or embrace it maybe. And yeah, how do you consider fermentation to go in this world?
So I think, yeah, if you're doing anything within the world of food and drink, in the current day, it's very difficult not to see, if you start scratching a little bit and interrogating, how do we eat and what do we eat, where does it come from, who produces it, how much do they get paid for producing it, to not see the inequity and inequality and imbalance that is really hardwired into, current global food systems. And when you start fermenting and working with fermented products, it really helps to, I suppose, reshape the way you might see the world. Obviously, we live in a world which is very human-centric, and inherently, when you're fermenting, you're working with these organisms that you can't see them, but you can taste or see or smell the products of their life cycle. So it helps you really move away from that status quo idea of like, okay, it's just humans and we're shaping the world and we're shaping food and we're shaping things around us. And you have to, when you ferment, it's this highly collaborative process of trying to curate the environment of your food stuff such that these microbes that you want to grow and flourish are able to survive, and that the ones that you don't want to flourish and survive don't. So it just forces you to be in a much more cooperative, collaborative space, and then it also blows open this idea of, okay, it's just humans. And then obviously, all food matter is sort of plant matter and animal matter. So it just gets you thinking about the role that humans play in relation to many other different types of organism.
And how much do you have to control that to get good fermented things?
A lot. So, essentially the line of, I suppose you have deliciousness at one end and then decay, let's say, at the other end. And it really is just a kind of a spectrum. And I suppose you start somewhere in the middle, and whether you end up with something very tasty or with something that's awful / potentially dangerous really is to do with, choice and volition and curation, and how you control the environment for these microorganisms. So when we're talking about fermenting, normally we're controlling those environments with, let's say, temperature, time, adding salt, the particular concentration of salt, we're controlling it with the pH, so acidity and alkalinity, and we're controlling it by controlling how much sort of substrate there is for these organisms to feed on. So, if we put a source of sugar for a yeast, then it will, it is likely to thrive. But if we remove that source of sugar, then it will struggle. So we're controlling the environments when we ferment for these organisms with a few different critical variables.
Yeah, it's more like about creating conditions, I guess, for life to grow.
Absolutely.
But it's funny because I guess at the beginning, the fermented products were about just like time and climate go together, and probably we got to see, human beings got to see how the products went through the seasons, right? So there's still something very instinctive, I guess, in fermentation.
Yeah, instinctive and spontaneous, of course, is all of those processes originally were spontaneous, and I guess enterprising humans realized, okay, if we mush the grapes up and we leave them there, then it kind of tastes like this, and if we mush the wheat up and leave it there with some water, then it ends up tasting like this, and then if we bake that, then it tastes really good. And over thousands of years, people have refined and perfected those processes, and then also refined and perfected the communities of organisms that can produce these foods. So now we have like a starter culture in let's say the kombucha that got sent out to various participants of the event. Those kombucha scobies are, there's a degree of wildness and spontaneous to them, but they've been cultivated. So we might not know until we do some kind of, microbiological tests on them exactly what's in there, but they have been cultivated and controlled to some degree.
And as we talked about, like the future of food, for example, in this food system that we have now, and our food cultures also that like we accumulated probably quite a luxurious behavior towards food because we eat very intensively meat, for example, also a lot of spices that comes from so far away, a lot of vegetables that comes from far away. And in this future, are you able now to see the role that fermentation can stand?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's sort of two aspects to that in the current world. One is that, let's say, of 7 billion people, we have close to 1 billion who are undernourished, who don't have enough nutrients. But then you have about 40% of the world population who are suffering or at risk of suffering from diseases of basically overconsumption. So we're eating too much, sugar or protein. We have these, cancers and diabetes and such. So there's kind of two aspects to that. But actually, fermentation can play a role in both of those, I think. So if we look at the sort of parts of the world where people don't have access to nutrients, one of the reasons why people started fermenting was to preserve food. So, you can basically make things shelf stable by fermenting it. So getting it to a point where it's not going to change. It's not going to get spoiled by spoilage organisms. So having fermented foods in areas where, let's say, you don't have, electricity to run fridges, right, is great. Similarly, people would ferment because you can make nutrients more bioavailable. So let's say if you take a legume and I just eat the steamed legume, like a soybean or something, then the human body might only be able to extract a certain amount of nutrients from that. Whereas if we ferment it, if we let these microorganisms kind of do their thing, and they will eat and consume some of those chemical compounds that humans can't break down, and they will break them down into things that then, if we eat the fermented paste, we will be able to extract more nutrients from that. So they can help us in that way. Also, if we ferment, foodstuffs, we can actually break down some of what we call anti-nutrients. So things that might stop when we eat the food, they might stop some of the nutrients being absorbed by the human body. So we can actually break down some of those anti-nutrients such that more of the nutrients get absorbed by the human body. So there's definitely ways that fermentation can help in those contexts. And really that's why, if we look at the human history, then, most people were in the situation where, eating food was a priority and not something that it was easy to do. So, clearly it plays a role in that. But on the other side of that picture, where we're looking at, people in the world who are in this kind of luxurious position where we're over-consuming protein, we're over-consuming sugars, fermentation can play a role because it gives us access to flavors, let's say these kind of savory, meaty flavors, without having to, consume and kill animals. So we can create, by doing these sort of kind of umami-heavy ferments, so thinking of like miso pastes or soy sauces, if you were going to look at Japanese food culture, you can get access to these really, delicious, savory, meaty flavors, but just using vegetables and pulses, etc. So that's a way where we can move away from eating as many animals as we do, and in the industrialized, meat production, the very inhumane, unethical conditions that they live in and are produced in. We can move away from that by replacing some of those flavors and tastes with these vegetable-based ferments.
Yeah, I guess there is quite a challenge to bring back the fermentation in food cultures where it's now almost absent. I mean, it's not absent, but let's say that In Europe, for example, if we stay in this area, every country has his star fermented products, all right? It's like wine or cheese, bread, fishes, dried fishes and stuff. So that we accept because we know it, it's very famous, and we're usually very proud of it. And it's actually a nice gap between people that are not from the country, judging usually these kind of products, saying like it's very gross, because it's usually very intense tastes. So let's say that we accept a little range of fermented products, but how can we insert like fermenting, a lot of fermented other products, but also these habits of fermenting things? Did you find a way? Did you try? I mean, you probably did workshops with people. How do they react to that? Like,
yeah, I think probably the biggest issue is that, like you say, there are, all food cultures have fermented foods, and actually lots of the most, highly prized and common foods, breads, yogurt, butter, wine, any alcohol, etc., vinegars, chocolate, coffee, these are all fermented, and the fact that they're fermented has sort of just been normalized. We've kind of forgotten that they are fermented, and that's largely because the production of food for lots of people, definitely, let's say in Western Europe, North America, has just been outsourced. So, a household is no longer really involved in the processing, let alone the production of much of the food that it consumes. So we've kind of lost that knowledge, and that's true of, non-fermented foods as much as it is for fermented foods. So what you have is this kind of knowledge gap, and then this fear, especially when you're talking about fermented foods, because they are a bit weird, because they're alive, and there's this sort of there's this alchemy going on that people are a bit wary of, and again going back to this idea that it's very easy to go from delicious to decay, and from wonderful smells and tastes to like very repulsive ones. So you have to be careful, and then there is a wariness. But I think largely it's just this idea of introducing people to the idea that you can do these things very simply at home, that they don't require specialist equipment, and that all you need is a few key kind of principles to be able to do this safely, and then you will end up with this whole world, or access to this whole world of really delicious flavor profiles and textures that you can have in your kitchen. And actually, most fermented products, again, going back to this idea of that these are typically foods that our ancestors were eating because they had access to them. They were things that were abundant. So it's, when we ferment, often it's with things that are inexpensive, the most humble of vegetables that are typically very inexpensive compared to, let's say, meats.
It's true that there is also this pleasure of being part of a process when you start fermenting thing. Like, I did my first miso like 2 years ago, and I didn't get at that point that, okay, so miso is fermenting ingredients together, the koji, the soybeans, and salt. But putting your own hands in it and mixing it together is very important as well, because your hand bacteria are going to come in that. So it was basically Celine miso going on, and my neighbor was another miso, and probably they don't taste exactly the same. And there is also this, I think, a very beautiful thing with fermentation that allows people to be part of the process again and have like a human signature in it. It's not only like shaping something and have a distance with it. You're completely part of it, and a part of you is in the food, and then you eat the food, and it's part of you. So I think there is a nice, but this is a whole like new world, because we're not used to it, and there is it's a whole vision, I guess.
Yeah, and it's funny because when you look at what humans regard as, luxury and luxurious, often it's basically to do with that idea of scarcity and idiosyncrasy. And actually that's what you get when you ferment, because there is always this input typically if you're doing it yourself in your kitchen, of you, and it's unbelievably unique. You know, the miso that you make or the kraut that you make will be different to the one that I make, even if we're stood in the, you know, side by side in the same kitchen. So there's this inherent idiosyncrasy and uniqueness. So we're kind of, you know, it's like this democratization of luxury in a way that you have access to these incredibly special, you know, once in a lifetime almost products. And I think you really only realize that when you start making them yourself. But there is this value add, you know, valorization of the process because of that. But also, you know, as soon as you start making these things yourself, you appreciate just how much labor, you know, if you have to make like 2 kilos, which isn't a lot of sauerkraut, you know, chopping 2 kilos of cabbage, you know, it's kind of hard work. And if you do 10 kilos, then it's definitely hard work and you'll be fed up of chopping the cabbage. So you realize all of these food processes that have been outsourced over the last 100 years, let's say, when you start making your own food, you get a real appreciation for like, okay, this actually requires a lot of you know, human or non-human labor, and that you start appreciating these products that you've had to make yourself.
Yeah, there is still definitely something that you can transmit through fermented products, whether it involves human energy, but I would say also intention and emotions, probably, because you have to put good intention in it. Otherwise, it's, as you say, very, very hard work. So if you don't do it in a good vibe, let's say, to be very general. But it makes me think of a tea that I tasted last year also, a tea that was made in China. So monks slept over the tea for like a few years, I think. So the tea fermented with all the monks, whatever was going on in the mattress. And also probably all their, if we think in a more esoteric way, maybe all their dreams went in this tea too. And so if the story is also nicely told to you, you get all these things in the tea, which is really nice. And I think also that could be a way, if we think of the future of food. I mean, there is all this, when you think about the future of food, there is all the technological answers to, of course, like create fake meat, eating insects that we don't do yet, finding like new way of growing vegetables, la la la. But I think there is also, and that's the very low tech aspect of the fermentation, like also a lot of stories to tell to people through food and to make them able to make this food their own, I guess.
Yeah, I think, you know, absolutely food is all about emotion and storytelling. And I think, you know, clearly there is a place and to a degree a necessity for these like all proteins, etc. And, you know, hydroponics, which can save water and energy, etc. But, you know, there is this huge value of kind of re-engaging with that idea that of the stories behind the food that we eat, because what, you know, when you add this layer of narrative onto a food or food experience, it elevates it and it just forces you to focus your attention on something. And, you know, when you taste like a carrot, when you really think about eating a carrot's quite, you know, the flavor profile it's quite odd and weird and special, but most of the time we eat carrots, you know, it's like the side bit of something else. And you're not very mindful. But if you can stitch a story around the carrots, whether it's because they're fermented, whether they've been turned into some kind of, you know, vinegar, but if it makes you pay attention to the consumption of the carrot whilst you're eating, then, you know, typically you will get more out of that experience. So I think that's where the kind of narratives around fermentation and, you know, with the tea, does it really matter if the monks actually slept on the tea, or even if they slept on the tea, does it matter if something, you know, their sweat drips onto it or their dreams were imbued in it? Not really, because it just makes you think about when you're drinking that tea, you know, what if those things happen?
You are creating the myth as well. Yeah.
What are the possibilities? And just, again, it's so much of the food we produce and so much of the meals we eat these days, I think, are just undervalued. You know, this idea of eating has become, for many people in the world, so easy, and it's just become this thing that we have to do 3 times a day, and it's food as energy. When you look at things like Soylent and Huel, these kind of powdered mixes, it's just become this food as energy or food as a supplement, and we've lost that idea that food should be, it should be magical. It is emotional. We eat our emotions. It's very true, and I think re-engaging with that idea of storytelling around food, which fermentation is so ripe for, because it's, it engages with these worlds that we can't see. It engages with these organisms. It's very kind of multisensory and 3-dimensional. So I think that's one of the real powers of fermentation.
And maybe you could maybe give us a few examples of, because I know you've been traveling around Europe and other continents too, but also Northern Europe, and you've been seeing probably like ingredients or techniques for people to get in touch with, let's say, complex climate situation. Would you have some examples to give us?
Yes, so I just came to here from Denmark and met an amazing woman called Aviaya, who is from Greenland. She's a microbiologist, essentially. She did her PhD in microbiology and is now doing a postdoc exploring essentially the microbiology of traditional Greenlandic foods. And so with her, I tasted this kind of fermented seal fat. So in Greenland, a very, well, what is extreme, I guess, but I was going to say an extreme climate or an inhospitable climate, but really, who's to say what extreme is? There's this whole kind of cache of microorganisms that we call extremophiles, and we call them extremophiles because they live in environments that would be extreme for humans, but for the extremophile, let's say an event, the bottom of the ocean where it's spurting out hydrogen sulfide gas or something, that's a perfectly normal environment. So all of these, the idea of extreme is yeah, totally. But in Greenland they have very little access to carbohydrates, so their diet is largely fat-based and protein-based. They're eating birds, fishes, and sea mammals. So this kind of what we would see as slightly unusual diets, actually quite similar to the Atkins diet, which was this kind of faddish weight loss diet like 10 years ago, which is basically where you can eat as much protein and fat as you want, you just don't eat carbs. But anyway, Greenlandic people eat what is very close to this faddish kind of Hollywood Atkins diet. But yeah, it's, tasting with her this seal fat and then some fermented fish and fermented or dried kind of muskox is super fascinating, because there are some products around which, like you said with the cheese, that if you're not used to these things, you might think of them as they might be repulsive, or even the idea of eating a seal might seem to some people as being inhumane. But it's, for me, eating a seal is no less cruel than eating a chicken or a pig, really. But those experiences, they just help you to, I guess, question, why do we eat the foods we eat? Why do we think pork is normal, but seal meat is weird or different or exotic or cruel? And I would say my experiences of this very fortunate job that I have, where I get to travel around parts of the world and try all, these amazing fruits in Brazil, or, fermented meats from Greenland. It just helps you, question what do we eat, why do we eat, what is normal. And I think what you also start to see, that this fermented, this seal fat it smelt of like pineapple and guava. It's very odd. And so you have these things which are, meaty, but they smell very fruity. And, where pineapples and guavas grow in like the tropics. So you have these flavor compounds essentially, which are common between fruits from this part of the globe and meat products in this part of the globe.
Yeah, but it made you think about pineapple because you know pineapple, and that was the reference that your brain connected to, I guess.
So so probably a Greenlandic person would eat a pineapple and be like, "Oh, this smells of seal."
Maybe, yeah.
So I love that kind of duality. There's a famous story. Alex Atala, who's this Brazilian chef, I think he was cooking a dish for a woman, an Amazonian woman, and she ate this thing that had lemongrass in it, or she ate a bit of lemongrass, and she was like, "Oh, this tastes of ants." And then Alex ate the ants, and he was like, "Oh, this tastes of lemongrass." Of course, which you take as the root and which you take as the sort of the derivative, just is dictated by where where your frame of reference starts from. But going back to fermentation, what fermentation often does is unlock these chemical compounds through these cascades of reactions. So you can start with, let's say something boring in quote marks like a soybean or a grain of wheat, and you end up with these, again in quote marks, tropical fruity notes. And so you just have these, these chemical compounds are essentially the same, whether it's in a pineapple or in a seal fat, they're probably the same, or they're from the same families of chemical compounds, but they've been unlocked by these different, cascades of chemical reactions. And fermentation and the microbes that enact fermentation give us access to these compounds, which otherwise we might not be able to create in our food.
And talking about very far away foods, like from one point of the planet to the other, before the record, we talked a little bit about the capacity of fermentation also to replace, which is not a very rich word because it's not about replacing, but like creating taste that satisfy our palate, because we're kind of like craving for certain tastes, umami, for example, that you can maybe talk a little bit about. And and so we talked about this like capacity of fermentation to transfer the product and create these satisfying tastes, and also and it's sometimes and very often working with indigenous species and invasive species as well, which is a nice match, I think. Maybe you had some. We talked about the coffee, for example.
Yeah.
And,
yes, so I mean, there's this the basic human tastes are there for really good evolutionary reasons, to steer us away from things that might poison us and to steer us towards nutritious things that we need to survive. So that craving of like sugary things or fatty things or salty things or proteinous that high protein things, which kind of is underpinned by that sense of umami. It's there for good reason. So people eating loads and loads of meat is, there is a sort of rational reason why it's there. There's also an overlay of culture, meat being scarcer and traditionally only being eaten by, the wealthiest and richest of people. So meat is a status symbol, which obviously does also influence why we crave meat. But yeah, fermentation gives us access to creating these umami-rich profiles. So using simple things like vegetables, we can create flavor profiles that resemble and have that same satiating qualities that, a big roast chicken also.
so umami can be chemically explained, right?
Yeah, so it's umami is basically, so monosodium glutamate, MSG, is this kind of classic expression of umami, but glutamic acid is this kind of what's giving you that umami flavor, and that's again, it's just a relatively simple chemical compound that can be created not just from meat but from vegetables, from pulses, etc. So we can create those satiating experiences within non-meat-based food, or we can create a plate of food where maybe there's a little bit of meat, but you're getting that satiating quality from umami ferments. So that's a great way that we can reduce the amount of meat that we consume in a way that doesn't negatively impact my experience of eating. Because of course, what you don't want to do is lecture to people you can't eat meat, and for them to then be stuck eating this kind of bowl of gruel that they're not enjoying, because that's it's not going to work, right? People are going to say, I don't like this, I'm going to carry on eating meat. So we need to find ways to where deliciousness is still that key component of the food we eat, but we can do it, and it's a very viable way for us to, as a planet, for those of us who do overconsume meat at the minute, for us to eat less meat.
Nice opening conclusion for this meat issue. And unless you have a last funny story to tell us about I don't know, the weirdest experience you've ever made, or
Yeah, I mean, so a question that people often ask me is, what is the weirdest thing you've eaten? And I used to say, there's a couple of stories, in the Nordic Food Lab in Copenhagen, where I was for a little bit. We had this castorum, this sort of beaver gland, which they use for scenting, I guess, for either warding off predators or attracting mates. And it had been, I think, just preserved rather than fermented. But it's quite weird to eat a beaver gland, and I might have also said, I ate this fermented seal fat, this seal blubber. But I suppose I've started more and more to think about, I think it's dangerous to start applying those labels to other people's foods,
No, I'm more thinking about experience you have made, that would be
created myself.
Yeah, because of course, thinking of other cultures' food that you would think weird is probably deconstructing everything we just said. But yeah, maybe you started something that went maybe more crazy than you would thought.
Yeah, well, I've definitely, the working with these things which have a degree of, spontaneity within them, there are always ferments that you make that can go a bit wild sometimes. But I suppose one of the things that I've gotten really into the idea of is taking these highly industrialized, highly processed foods and then kind of ripping them apart using, this sort of wonderful power of fermentation. So I made a kind of series of these things. So I took Guinness, the beer, the drink, which is, delicious. I love Guinness. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Guinness, but then basically applied these ferment processes to it and created this Guinness Garum. So, garum is this Roman word for fish sauce. So I basically mixed the Guinness with koji, this fungus, and some salt, and blended it and left it for 3 months, and ended up with this Guinness Garum.
Wow.
Which had, had this kind of those classic malty notes and chocolatey notes of a Guinness, of a stout, but then also, I guess, some yeasts got in there as well, and it had these very fruity, kind of pineapple-y, kind of overripe pear notes. And then also, because I put salt in it, had all the, it was very salty, but that was delicious and kind of weird. So I did a whole series. Took this Lambrini wine, which is it's basically made of pears. I think they only sell it in England. It's very cheap. It's basically an incredibly cheap way to get drunk. And did the same thing. So basically made a vinegar out of it and took what was, I don't like the taste of Lambrini, but created this highly concentrated vinegar out of it, which was, I would say, much more delicious. So I like this idea of taking these industrialized, highly processed products and then just kind of ripping them apart and playing with them.
Yeah, it's about food hacking, basically. Huh?
Yeah, totally. And I think, there's why, I guess the question is, why do you have to start with something kind of raw and pure. You know, why do you have to start with a raw carrot or a soybean? Like, let's somebody in a Q&A recently asked me, I think they asked me, can you ferment cookies, you know, chocolate biscuits? And I was like,
Can
yes.
you? Yeah.
You know, why not?
I don't know. We could think that in industrial food, you have all this. I mean, the food is very processed, and you have a lot of addition to it, right?
Yeah.
And there is this like myth, which I don't think is a myth after all, that the McDonald's hamburger, for example, doesn't go bad for like 2 years or something like that. So how can you ferment that? Because it seems that this food is already so protected by all those, you know, inputs that they made in it, they put in it.
Yeah, so there's certainly, you know, you in that kind of heavily industrialized food, people add, you know, stabilizers and preservatives, you know, potassium sorbate or something like that, and that will inhibit, you know, microbial activity. But normally you can, you know, life always finds a way, right? And you can, if you add enough other, let's say you mix it with some other carbohydrates, starches, or sugars, that might kind of kickstart the microbial process, and then they will eventually kind of take over and dominate. So you can definitely break down these things, often actually with very little effort. You know, I think Twinkies, which is this, I'm not sure if I've ever eaten a Twinkie, but it's like an American sweet, and they say that they have a shelf life of like 10 years or something, maybe longer. And then I think they stopped making them, and then there was this huge outcry because, you know, the people of America were like, we love our Twinkies, please somebody start making them again. So they started making them. But they're supposed to have this very, you know, they're like the cockroach of the food world in that they're sort of indestructible. But normally, you know, that's one of the powers of, I often say, you know, when I often put on my kind of chemist hat, even though I'm not really a chemist anymore, for sure. But when you think about, when you put on your chemist hat, you just, you start seeing foodstuffs in this deconstructed way. You just see them in terms of like, okay, this is, 20% protein and 20% carbohydrate and some other stuff, you know, let's say 60% water. Therefore, I know there's protein and I know there's carbohydrate. Therefore, I can take these microorganisms out of my fermenting toolkit and throw them in here, and I'll probably end up with something that tastes like this.
And what about like the bad stuff that are in this industry food? Like, for example, if you start a fermentation with a non-organic vegetable, and let's say there are all these chemicals in it, does the fermentation take them away, or how does it go?
Yes, I mean, you know, you would get breakdown of some of those products. Actually, with the Lambrini vinegar, the Guinness was, although it has a alcohol content, was quite easy to ferment. The Lambrini, which would have some, you know, sulfites as preservatives in, took a lot longer for the acetic acid bacteria in the vinegar mother that I added to it to really kind of take hold and do its thing.
So once it starts fermenting, you can assume that the bad stuff are out somehow, or?
Well, firstly, I would say it's dangerous to call them bad stuff because obviously, you know,
I'm thinking more about the agriculture bad stuff, like chemicals that we put on them.
Yeah, so I don't know actually enough about how those compounds would break down, but you know, most stuff, you know, there are compounds which persist and don't break down. You know, you look at plastics, it takes them a long time for them to break down, and there are some other chemicals that are used in you know, large-scale agriculture, which we're now aware of that it takes a long time to break down. But breaking down is the kind of the default in nature. So, you know, most of these products, these chemical compounds, will break down eventually. You might have to work a little bit harder, but yeah, you know, again, it depends on what. Let's say the Twinkie, probably a lot of the reason why it persists for so long is that it's in that wrapper, and that's, you know, as soon as you take off that wrapper, then suddenly it's a much less stable product. But it's, you know, it's definitely important that we investigate what are these compounds that are going into various foods, and how long do they persist in the food chain. Actually, going back to the Greenlandic diet, what you get is further up the food chain is, you know, as smaller things eat, as bigger things eat smaller things, you get this bioaccumulation, let's say, of heavy metals. So people were doing studies on people eating, whale meat, and obviously whales are, the biggest of the big predators. And what they're finding is there are these heavy metals bioaccumulating in the flesh and bodies of these whales. And then when humans are eating these whales, they're also getting exposed to these large concentrations of heavy metals. So we have to, of course, think about what's bioaccumulating.
My last question would be about the water that you might use in the fermentation. Does the source of the water matters?
I mean, water is really, I could talk for a long, long time about water. It's
Big subject, sorry to,
yeah.
to put that up in the end.
Again, it's one of those things, it's the ultimate food, really, in the sense that, going back to that idea of we take so much amazing food, carrots, potatoes, which have these really unique flavor profiles, and we're just like, it's just a carrot, it's just a potato. And water is like the king or queen of that, because for most people, thankfully, where we live, we have access to clean water. Many people in the world don't, but for those of us that do, we just we turn on the tap, it comes out, and no one talks about water. Very few people go, this is delicious. But what the flavor profiles of different waters are very broad, and water can be delicious. When you make ramen noodles, you have to use this very soft water, otherwise you don't get this this reaction with the alkaline powder, the kansui that you add. And if you don't use the soft water, but you use everything else the same, you get noodles that aren't springy, and so then you don't get that really satisfying.
That's right, God,
kind of
yeah.
slurp.
Thanks for the tip.
Yeah, actually, so I grew up in a town called Birmingham, which is in the middle of the UK. It's not known as being a beautiful city. It's quite industrial. Sprang up post or mid-industrial revolution, and I always remembered this water that came out of the tap in my had a sink in my bedroom, and I would wake up in the middle of the night and drink from this tap, and that memory was like profoundly beautiful, like one of my favorite kind of food or taste flavor memories. And I always thought it must just be this sort of figment of my imagination, like the water from Birmingham can't be really delicious water. And this was always playing in my mind, and then I finally like Googled it like 2-3 years ago, and I found that actually the water for this kind of quadrant of like the southwest of Birmingham comes from mid Wales, in actually this quite beautiful like rural area, and it's this giant reservoir, and they built this aqueduct to bring this water into Birmingham. So I don't know, at least must be 100 miles, probably I don't know, let's say 100 miles, but a long way. And so it actually is this kind of it is this special water. So it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was this sort of delicious, sort of rural, beautiful water from mid Wales. So now, I mean, I don't go back to there very often, but if I'd have gone back to visit my aunt this Christmas, I was going to take some bottles and fill it up and have this sort of water of my childhood.
Getting back at this source. Well, thank you very much for this talk, Johnny. I think we went through a lot of very diverse subjects, and I like also how it's linked to the rest of the festival program, and the fact that when you work with food through science and art, probably you do these connections to so much different subjects and people and cultures. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a good day.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi, just waiting for everybody to turn on the cameras so we can have maybe some questions.
Hey, Marante.
Hi, Johnny and Anna. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was so nice. That was a revelation. I'm also super interested what you said about microorganisms breaking down components, and the relationship with taste. I find that very, very interesting, and also the connection to how this can be used in order to create different, let's say, different situations regarding to what we eat and what we can eat also for the future. Do you get invited by organizations that would benefit of this kind of knowledge regarding, let's say urgent matters at this point, such as the IPCC, the climate change debates that we have and other kinds of institutes?
Yeah, I've not worked with like the IPCC or really on climate change per se, but obviously when we're talking about food, inherently we're talking about climate change, and the food industry is a big producer of greenhouse gases, etc. But certainly I'm working with people who are producing alternative proteins, or thinking about how to feed the world. So some of those are very relatively large scale producers, and some are kind of smaller startups, and I guess vary from anywhere on the spectrum of like really weird quasi dystopian, I think, did we mention Huel and Soylent in the talk?
Yeah.
Versus like, just new, different alternative approaches to holistic agriculture. And I'm kind of fairly agnostic about which of those are the best ways to proceed. I think it will ultimately be a combination of some of those high-tech approaches, and then some of, let's say, lower tech, more holistic approaches to agriculture.
But that's also very interesting, because you have on the one hand the technological situation, on the other hand is an awareness situation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to, humans, we get very confused about what technology is and what technology isn't. And, a knife is a piece of technology, and clothing is a piece of technology. And, often in whatever time you're living in, we can be very scared, sometimes for good reason, of the cutting edge of technology in our present day. But I think we have to remember that all of these things, when we're talking about agriculture, the wheat that we grow or the apples that we grow have all been artificially selected and cultivated, and are basically not, wheat is not natural, apples are not natural. Pink grapefruit is a great example. Pink grapefruits were basically invented in, I think, the 60s, maybe the 40s, by firing X-rays at regular grapefruit seeds, and there was a genetic mutation, and they produced this grapefruit that was pink, and they were like, A, this is fun, B, this is delicious, let's grow it. So the food that we eat is a product of technology.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If any one of you has any questions, just ask. I know that some of you here have been ordering some kombucha scobies that come directly from Johnny's lab. They've been sent on Monday, so hopefully they'll be here by the end of the week. But if you have any question, just ask.
Hi, thank you for this conversation. I'm quite new to Dr. Johnny and all of this program. I'm very happy that I discovered it in Instagram, actually. Probably this question you get asked a lot. However, I'm quite curious about how do you control these potential toxic outcomes. For example, just as an example, when you ferment cookies or so, how do you make sure that it's not going to drive into something toxicological that we don't know? And I mean, something there's obvious, like botulismus, for example, and there's like an obvious way to control it. But on the side that we don't know very well, do you have like a certain parameters or yeah?
It's a great question, and I think it's one of the things that, you know, there's this sort of there's a sense of like mysticism and kind of vagueness around fermentation, which I think is what some people, when they start, is what makes them a bit nervous about, am I going to poison myself or someone that I love or live with. So, it's very important for us to address that. So I guess the first thing is just, understanding what could go wrong. So trying to understand what risks are involved. So depending on the ferment, depending on what, macromolecules, proteins, carbohydrates, sugars, fats are in a thing will dictate, perhaps how it might potentially go wrong. But then when we talk about the things that we control, the like critical control points, there's sort of 4 or 5, which I'll just reel off very quickly, but essentially time, something fermented for 1 week will probably look very different fermented for 1 year, and you might eat it after a week, but you might not after 1 year. So time, salt, pH, so acidity and alkalinity, what microorganisms are present at the start. So sometimes you might pasteurize, let's say you're working with milk. Typically, most people these days would pasteurize their milk. So you're starting from a blank slate and then add in a known starter culture. That's basically what you would do with your kombucha as well. So you would probably boil your tea and then you're adding in your more or less known starter culture. And then the 5th one, I think we've done 4. The 5th one would be, what food is there for the microbes to eat. So if you put a lot of sugar in, then that's a lot of food. There's an abundance of nutrients, and therefore you would expect an abundance of microorganisms. Whereas if you only put in a very little amount of sugar or carbohydrates, then you're limiting, you're providing this bottleneck for growth. So those are the major 5, I would say.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm going to just write in, so Aviaya, who we mentioned, the Greenlandic researcher, I've just put her Instagram account in the chat as well, in case anybody missed it. But she's just like amazing, super cool, really inspirational, and you should definitely check her work out.
Well, actually, I have a question, Johnny. I wonder what drives you in your research? Like, is it according to the people you meet? And I know that you do consulting for restaurants, for example, but what drives your inspiration, basically?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I don't think I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, so this might be a slightly woolly, off-the-cuff answer, but I guess, inherently, I've done a few things in my life. I studied science. I actually worked in finance for a couple of years, which I don't really talk about. But I guess the central part of or the thread that connects all these things is just probably slightly annoying, if you spend a lot of time with me, slightly annoying desire to answer questions and like prod things and push things and figure out, why does that do that, or why does that work like that, or why is that color? So I guess that's at the core, but then the second layer is probably, about people. And that's the great thing about working in food, food is this nexus of like lots of different disciplines, but then there are such amazing and often, quite weird people working in food. If you work, let's say I work with chefs, most chefs or a lot of chefs, let's say, haven't had a university education. Lots of chefs left school at 16 to 18. So I'm coming from this life where I've like basically been institutionalized by like academic institutions, spent like 10 years roaming around university libraries, and I love it. But then I get to interface and talk with these people who've like had very, comparatively limited formal education. And that's really, it's really amazing, because those people obviously see the world in a very different way. And that's healthy, I think, for someone like me that's, used to having my head in a book or in a, on Wikipedia for like 2 hours a day, like looking at things. So I get to work with these people from all sorts of works of life. I think when we look at the balance of like gender and kind of sex and race within food, it's not perfect, but I think it's probably slightly better than in other fields that I've worked in. So again, you get to work with lots of great people from a really diverse range of backgrounds, and it's not difficult to search out people from a diverse range of backgrounds when you're working in food. So I guess that ability to work with great people with great stories, often people who've maybe rejected some kind of like status quo, or like this regular kind of jobs or regular paths through life. So yeah, lots of great stories and people to learn from.
There are some questions in the chat, maybe from Emmanuel.
Yes, the sugars question is really interesting. So the first thing, well, some people, or because we use this word sugar to describe this stuff that comes in packets, and it's white or it's brown, it can be a bit confusing. But so sucrose, which is table sugar, is just one type of sugar, and there's lots of, within nature, there's lots of different types of sugar. Now, most microbes can often break down a bunch of different types of sugars, but there are certain types of sugars that some microbes cannot break down. So if you're coming from a beer background, then you will hear reference to, or a wine background, you'll hear reference to non-fermentable sugars. With that said, if the question is specifically about like, muscovado sugar or turbinado sugar, or like free trade, organic, gourmet, Marks and Spencer's is this fancy supermarket in the UK. That's all basically sucrose. So if you use that fancy brown Demerara sugar versus, the cheapest of the cheap white sugar, your microbes won't care about that. If you use a brown sugar, you'll get some extra caramel notes, which is nice. And obviously it will affect the color, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But in terms of that range of table sugars, they're all the same. But then when you start looking at like galactose, lactose, which is the sugar found in milk, then you might have some differences of microbes being able or not able to digest those. Did that answer the question, Emmanuel?
Yeah, actually, it was exactly that last part about lactose, galactose, or even honey, which is also quite like a very complex type of sugar, also integrating a lot of micro ingredients and stuff. And that was really like the point of the question, like questioning how like natural type of sugars could change the fermentation process. I haven't been able to try it myself, but I'm very questioning.
Yeah, I mean, honey is super fascinating. Actually, hopefully next year, fingers crossed, I'm going to be doing a project with some Brazilian partners, with the Alex Atala Foundation, and some people doing some great work in the kind of, well, not just in the Amazon, but all across Brazil, to do with Brazilian honeys. But honey is super fascinating. And sometimes there are these kind of myths around, people say, oh, you can't ferment honey. But you definitely can. Mead is within Europe is this very ancient alcoholic beverage that actually, I believe, predates wine and beer. And in Brazil, the honeys have a much higher water content, so they're very liquid, and because of that, they ferment spontaneously and naturally, so they have much higher acidity, and the flavor profiles are just, if you're used to, or if you only know sort of thicker set European honey, you taste these Brazilian and I presume South African more widely honeys, and the flavor profiles are like just mind-blowing and like thrilling. So honeys do ferment, but yeah, often what you find is that there will probably be some scientific peer-reviewed journal articles around these topics, what sugars do ferment, but there's always a bit of a disconnect between that and the sort of more kind of folk documentation of recipes. And I guess that's probably what some of my work is to do with, or people like the Nordic Food Lab who I worked with, that it's their ambition to kind of bridge that gap between like really hardcore science and then this either softer science or more kind of folk documentation of recipes and gastronomy, which I think has like really high value for us to do that, because I think it's important to connect those two worlds. Should I do the next question?
Yeah, there are a few questions after that. Actually, there is Ashley's question about that we've been a little bit through in the conversation about the bio, non-bio, and the pesticides ending up in fermentation. I think you started answering that during our conversation, actually.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. So it's quite complex, I guess. But if you had a product that was, hadn't been treated or sterilized, pasteurized in any way, then inherently it will always have, a greater amount of microorganisms on it than something that has been. But again, the point is that these things are just everywhere. So even if you took, let's imagine the worst potato or apple possible, like it's had herbicides, insecticides thrown on it for its entire life, and then it's been zapped with like UV rays to extend its shelf life. But the second that it like goes on a supermarket shelf, or it goes in the back of a van to transport it somewhere, things will start landing on it, and they will, they will be able to consume and access the nutrients in the apple. So very little of the world around us is truly sort of, is free of microbial life. So even the very worst, and I say worst in inverted commas there, the most highly processed industrialized agricultural products can support microbial life. It might just take them a bit longer. So again, I'm kind of quite agnostic on the role of pesticides and herbicides and insecticides. I think there is a role for them. I think certainly we definitely overuse them, and I'm definitely anti-monoculture, but I think we should embrace them as a tool for being able to, produce abundant, healthy food for the whole planet. And yeah, definitely life can survive on these things, even if they've been treated with them. I haven't done any research myself on it, but hopefully people definitely do, yeah.
I might just do a point. Emmanuel asked about, do you consider fermentation as an anarchist way of seeing the world? I would say, to answer this, that of course now fermentation is a metaphor of a lot of visions in the society, like fighting for collaboration, spreading life everywhere, and raising life where we do not expect it, etc. So this is very indeed political, and a lot of artists now are working with fermentation in that way. To answer that, I might I'll write it in the chat, but there are two references you can read for that.
for example, and probably a lot of more. I'm just thinking of actually fermentation as a metaphor by author Sander Katz, and another book from Annette Zil called Mushrooms at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. I think, Emmanuel, you might like it. So I'll write it in the chat.
Yes, Sandor's latest book, Fermentation as Metaphor, definitely touches upon those themes. And I think, one of the things I talk about a lot is how a lot of the problems with current food systems are as a result of us having become divorced from the food we eat and how it's grown. And any step that you or I or anyone in the world can make to re-engage with that production of food, I think is is very political and an emphatic thing to do.
I think we have a question by Celia Ortiz.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I was just, I guess it connects to what we were just talking about, but I wanted to know your take about the fact that fermentation has become a thing, or has risen during the global pandemic, and having this possibility of having, different processes and moving a bit slower through life and through our normal institutional, framework. And so I just wanted to know, what do you think? Like, why do you think this has happened? And maybe just a comment on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think with respect to this year and the pandemic, one probably maybe to do with control. This idea of if you're making your own sourdough at home, you're exercising this degree of control over this thing in a year where probably much of the world felt very out of control and powerless, and lots of the things that within our normal lives that used to give us feelings of control were taken away from us this year because we lost access to these routines. So I think one, when you just cooking in general, making your own food, being in charge of that gives you a sense of control, which I think probably has been important for a bunch of people. Secondly, perhaps even in the UK, which is like a highly developed nation, at the very start of lockdown once in March, April, May, supermarket shelves were bare, and it was difficult to get flour and sugar and eggs. And so I think, faced with that notion of, which was very, unfortunately, lots of people, that's normal for lots of people in the world, but for lots of people in highly developed countries, that idea of abundance of food no longer being a thing was probably very scary, and probably it was the first time they really experienced that. Maybe our parents or grandparents who went through the Second World War might have been, had memories of it, but I think connecting that idea of scarcity and abundance, which is, core to really agriculture throughout history, I think probably that's prompted a lot of people to think, okay, what's actually in my larder, in my pantry, and how, what can I make with it to feed myself?
Thank you.
Wow, there's so much question in the chat now. Thank you everyone for writing everything. I'm gonna pick, so there is the umami point that someone's asking about, like about umami on a scientific point of view. Actually, you will be able to find easily the scientific aspect of umami, which is actually a molecular reaction that you can easily find on the internet, because it has been conceptualized also by, I think, Japanese scientists during the 20th century, if I'm not saying wrong. And which is also actually linked to the Maillard reaction, where you have this caramelization phenomenon when you cook a meat, for example, and you have this transformation between proteins and sugars. I was seeing a question about the role of fermentation as a cultural initiation. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, like how actually fermentation and fermented foods and drinks are a good entrance when you get in touch with a culture, and sometimes and very often a very intense entrance, because we're never used to that kind of tastes. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, Johnny?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, why are they such good access points to food cultures you might not be familiar with? Probably because fermentation is really old, and most of these fermented foods that are part of any given food culture have been a part of it and have been characteristic of it for, you know, probably hundreds, if not thousands of years. So, you know, you think of, well, ooh, I've got a phone call coming in. Let's just do that. You know, if you think of like France and cheese, or well, the whole of Northern Europe, you know, cheese and cheese culture, they're just like really stitched into the food that those people eat, and then even like how they go about, you know, their agriculture and what they prioritize. You know, so looking at having cattle to produce liquid milk to then make cheese, whereas in other parts of the world, if you look at Argentina, they have lots and lots of cows, but you know, not all, but mostly just for eating the meat. You know, they don't have a large liquid milk cheese culture. So the cows are there in both geographical regions, but they're there for very different priorities. So understanding that you can often do by you know, eating these fermented foods. Also, I guess maybe you could say that because in lots of food cultures, people, you know, scaling up fermented products is quite tricky, because you often have this slightly wild element that's difficult to control. And as a result of that, often fermented produce is produced still at a very small scale, and therefore you have lots of different smaller producers and lots of idiosyncratic products. So I guess that's also another reason why you might encounter fermented products if you're walking through like you know, a farmer's market or a street food market. You're perhaps more likely to encounter you know, really highly personalized expressions of fermented foods, versus if you're looking at something like, you know, a biscuit or a cake, where it's to industrialize those products is basically easier, and therefore has been done in lots of parts of the world.
There's been a last question that is quite interesting, I think, considering the whole sanitarization we're going through right now with the pandemic, and the fact that whether, let's say, there is this rise up of fermentation in art practices and restaurant practices, and on the other side, the society building a more and more sanitarized environment for all of us, like very hygienic. So the question is, do you think fermentation in the practical sense will gain momentum in consumerist society and communities outside the designers, theorists, artists community alike, and how? And this is very, very good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably our attitudes towards fermentation are essentially limited to, you know, that we have in English, we have this phrase that that a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. The idea that if you know nothing, it's quite liberating, and if you know like everything, then that's obviously, you get a full sense of the picture. But if you're stuck somewhere in the middle and you kind of understand, okay, this works in this way, then that's almost you know, more dangerous than knowing nothing or knowing everything. And I feel perhaps we're at that sort of point with our understanding of the roles that microorganisms play, you know, in the world, in that we know there are pathogenic ones that can cause us harm, and we know and harness ones that have beneficial outputs. But there is this sort of balance between those two things, and it's like we're not quite sure which side to embrace most at the minute. I think what will probably happen is, so at the minute the approach to sanitization is like just kill everything, right? Like just nuke it. So and that's kind of effective, but probably what we will see is a more nuanced understanding of how we use one set of microbes to outcompete another set of microbes. So basically, instead of nuking everything, so taking all those populations down to zero, which then actually just means you have a, if you have the conditions that are needed for life and you have zero microorganisms, then what can happen is actually anything can come in and colonize that space. So, if a pathogenic microbe comes in, then actually it can be, quite dangerous. Whereas if you have these robust, resilient communities of benign microbes, then they can actually do we can use them as sort of like armies, so they can outcompete and defend against these pathogenic ones. And we can probably work with these communities of microbes. So a great example of this is within cheese making and dairying. A lot of cheese makers would wipe down the kind of counters they were working with, to get the liquid off, but then they would just wipe their hands on the surfaces of their counters, with the idea that the lactic acid bacteria that their hands are covered in because they've been working with all this milk would then recolonize the counter and therefore exclude any pathogenic microbes. So there's things like that which people have been doing intuitively or instinctively or anecdotally for probably hundreds of years. And we've kind of gone, Sandor Katz calls it the war on bacteria. We've kind of gone to this other direction where we have the power and the understanding to like nuke stuff, but probably, I think, and hopefully, because I think it just seems a nicer, more collaborative way to work, we will move towards this idea of harnessing some microbes to basically perform those kind of sanitization functions or antibacterial functions. And that's that's what we do with like producing antibiotics like penicillin, right? It's produced by a fungi that produces that penicillin naturally.
Thank you. I'd like also to complete about the aspect of the question about how can it go out of the artistic world, which is a nice one, because of course those things also raise up like niche, and it's also our job to make it go through that and go to a wider audience, of course, and it's part of our artist practice actually. And if you pay attention, for example, to the next point in the program, which is Asli Hatipoglu work. She is building this sourdough revolution you can take part to. So basically you can subscribe and she's gonna send you some dehydrated sourdough that she made with a manual and all the explanations to take this sourdough back to life and build your own and make your own bread. So basically there are bridges that can be made, but these bridges, I think, in my point of view, have to be like explained, accompanied. We have, of course, to accompany people that are new in the fermentation, because there are all these fears that you are talking about in the question. But there are solutions, and probably these questions will always be an answer for those who don't feel like fitting in the hygienic society right now and are looking for a more involved process of life, like to those who want to know where their clothes are coming from, what built their houses, what is in their food. And all these people, I think, are an audience for us that are trying to input those fragments of visions in our world in the future. So yeah, Hasley here, you can see her on the camera, and we'll be presenting her amazing work at 5 p.m. if you want to join us, and then we'll follow her video by a Q&A like now. So if there are questions, because it's a whole fermentation day, basically, so if there are questions we didn't answer now, you can also join tonight and ask them again. And I'm sure we'll have a complete vision on all of these points. Yeah.
I wanted to say also, like, because this has been like a question about this anarchist point of view of this revolution, is that I believe that when knowledge starts to travel and people start having experience with also these fermentations, that they started developing a different value to the thing that they make. And I think it's very important that we also take care of our environment by understanding what goes on in the industry. And since like food connects us to share knowledge and discuss these problems together, I think the sourdough revolution in this way is about to creating this bridge between like separateness from our actual environment, but also from each other, but through actually regaining a knowledge and understanding it. Because I made these like manuals that talks about what is different type of wheats and flours and what are their differences, how do they react when you make a bread. So again, like Johnny said, there is so much scientific parts in how things react to each other, because once you understand that, I think your connection to what you eat becomes a deeper level, and then you started talking about it through your friends, through connecting and baking or sharing. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.
Also, if I may say something, hello everyone. For everyone that hasn't heard or read this yet, we're planning to put everything that happens during the festival online at some point. And this will be at the new Jan van Eyck website sometime in January, if all works out. That's a side note.
And yeah, thank you very much for your interest and your questions. It's always a pleasure to debate those subjects together, because it's a very collaborative one. So we'll see you in a few hours if you're here, and later. And don't hesitate also to contact us through Instagram or emails or whatever, if you have projects, a question, or whatever is in your mind. Thank you very much to you all, and bye-bye.
Thank you.